Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ian Mondro. I'm a partner in the global energy practice at Gowling WLG, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Ontario Energy Association's Speaker Series, Electricity Rates, Where Do We Go From Here? This webinar has been rescheduled from the originally planned date of March 17th. And if you recall, that was the date the state of emergency was announced in Ontario, and understatement of the day, things changed. And like many businesses and organizations, the OEA pivoted. And so here we are today, zooming into a different future. The original idea for this event was to discuss the then promised 12% electricity rate relief. And that discussion will now be informed by an entirely different set of circumstances. One thing that has not changed, however, is the OEA's continuing efforts to not only keep up with, but to keep to the front of change on behalf of you, its members, and others engaged in our sector. And leading those proactive efforts is Vince Brescia, President and CEO of the Ontario Energy Association and today's speaker. Before joining the OEA, Vince was the president of Wise Meter Solutions, a fast-growing national submetering and utility expense management company. Vince led that company through a period of 600% growth in customers. Prior to that, Vince was the president and CEO of the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario. And Vince has also served on the board of directors of the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation and Toronto Hydro. And just before handing the screen over to Vince, I will note that today's webinar will be recorded, and a link will be shared with all attendees and also available on the OEA's website in the coming days. You will also see a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen when you move your cursor down there. And please do ask questions through that mechanism, and we will get to all of the questions that we have time for. Coffee's in your kitchen, and since you all know where your closest washroom is, without further ado, Vince, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ian, for that introduction, and thanks to Gowling for their support in helping us host this webinar. And welcome everybody to our speaker series event on electricity rates. Ian, I was looking forward to seeing your playoff beard, but you've shaved for the webinar, so thanks for grooming on our behalf. But we want to get underway. We have a hard stop at 11:30, so I'm told. There's another webinar coming on to this service. So we're going to move very quickly. And just before we dive into the presentation, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, which is ACON and, as mentioned, Gowling. Thanks to both of them for their support for our speaker series event. I also want to take a moment to thank our corporate sponsors who support our public policy work, like the paper we're about to present to you today. Our diamond sponsor is Toronto Hydro. Our platinum sponsors are Electra, Enbridge, and Hydro One. Silver sponsors are Northland Power and OEC. And our bronze sponsor is Alexicon. Thank you to all of you for your support for our organization. And just a reminder, we do have a speaker series event coming up on September 17th. Paula Conboy has arrived back in Canada after a stint for several years as the head of Australia's energy regulator. I, for one, am really interested to hear about Paula's experience and what we can learn from that. I'm sure that was very interesting. As you may suspect, this could turn into a webinar rather than a luncheon event, but just so you know, that is on the books for now. So I'm going to transition to our presentation, but just before we do that, I'll give you a bit of a setup as to what it is we're going to be doing today. This is a presentation of a report that was originally written earlier in the year prior to the pandemic. It was entitled "Help Those Who Need Help," and it was a proposal to reduce electricity rates by 12% and stabilize bills. That report is on our website. And you can access it now if you want. And there's also a companion report written by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Some of you may remember Kevin Page, who's the head of that organization, the former Federal Parliamentary Budget Officer. We asked them to crunch the numbers on some 12% reduction options, and they did a companion report. So we also wrote an addendum to this report to reflect the new reality of the pandemic and the fact that we're in a post-pandemic world. And What we're going to do here today is take you through the original slides because people seem to be still curious about the 12% reduction initiative. But we are also going to speak to the addendum. And because of that, we're going to race through some of the slides. I'm going to be skipping over some of the slides, but you'll get to see some of what was going to be in our original presentation, because we want to have some time to talk about the update we provided in the addendum. And it's called Help Those Who Need Help. We think when you look at the facts of Ontario's situation, you'll naturally be drawn to the same conclusion we were, but you can be the judge. One other caveat and comment, this report is about RPP rates, the regulated price plan, which is residential rates and small business rates. There are a lot of other rate issues and issues in the sector. We are not speaking to those. We know there are other challenges in the sector that need attention, but we're not trying to boil the ocean in one study. So let's get it underway. Sorry, just gotta get our slides moving here. The starting point is what you're all aware of, is how much we're spending to subsidize electricity rates at the moment. We're spending about $5.6 billion. And sometimes when you talk about billions of dollars, people don't have a sense of what that means. Is that a lot? So let's put that into perspective. 5.6 billion, which we're spending to subsidize electricity rates, is more than we're spending on these ministries altogether if we combined all their budget, the priority areas of agriculture, economic development, environment, indigenous affairs, infrastructure, labor, municipal affairs and housing, and natural resources. That's an extraordinary statement about the priority we have to subsidize electricity rates. Here's another way to put electricity subsidies into perspective. 5.6 billion is more than we're spending entirely on the direct funding to colleges and universities. It's more than the entire budget of the Ministry of Transportation, which goes to our roads and our transit systems, and more than our drug programs and long-term care. And just a reminder, these slides were all written earlier year, so it's not meant to be a political statement on the long-term care. Now I'm going to skip a couple of slides. In our paper, we talk about what led us to this point, and there was an increase in electricity rates. We overhauled our generation fleet in Ontario essentially, and there's a cost associated with that, and naturally, electricity rates increased. And in 2016, in particular, there may have at the same time, we were pushing through a 10% increase in our RPP rates to pay for that overhaul. The government removed the clean energy benefit, which reduced bills by the total bill by 10%. So altogether, in 1 year, ratepayers experienced roughly an estimated 17.5% rate increase. So that brought us to the history we're all aware of. And this NANOS poll shows you, and by late 2016, hydro rates had uncharacteristically risen up to the top issue on the top of minds of voters over things like healthcare and the economy and education, which are normally top place finishers in these top of mind polls. And in response to that, we had all three political parties take strong position on hydro rates. They all have their own internal polling, and it was very clear that voters were not going to, we were getting a year away from an election, and it was very clear that voters were not going to vote for someone unless they were promising to do something about hydro rates, as we call them. So the government of the day, as you know, announced a 25% rate reduction. The New Democratic Party of Ontario proposed themselves a 30% rate reduction for people. And the Progressive Conservatives in their platform proposed an additional 12% rate reduction. So that was the parties of the day responding. But what we're going to see in this report is that the voter reaction was wildly disproportionate to the actual experience on the ground of most ratepayers. For some reason, hydro rates became a totem for everybody's discontent with the government, and they channeled all of that discontent into their anger about electricity rates. And it was something that I think, you could get agreement around the dinner table. A lot of political discussions you can't get into around the dinner table, but you can get the heads nodding if you start complaining about hydro rates. So they rocketed up to the top of the public agenda, and they stayed there. However, things have calmed down now. This is a poll that the OEA had done in May of last year, so roughly a year ago, and electricity rates have dropped out of the public agenda again, and things have stabilized and normalized again. So from our perspective, this makes it a good time to step back and take a look at what it is we're doing with our electricity programs and subsidies, and ask the question whether we're doing the right thing. And I know there was more recent polling in the last couple of weeks by Innovative Research Group that confirms that energy bills still aren't really a top of mind issue. So let's start by putting electricity rates in Ontario into perspective. Now, you would have thought by all that voter reaction that there was that we had, taken away a firstborn child or something by the way people reacted, and you would have thought there's something tremendously wrong. There's been extraordinary mismanagement of our system. Well, this slide is meant to put our rates into perspective in North America, and what you can see here is that we actually look very good. We have amongst the lowest rates in North America, and we're about 36%. Ontarians pay about 36% less than the average US citizen for their rates. And we even look good compared to the other provinces. There are two provinces that have significantly lower rates. I'll speak about those in a bit later, Quebec and Manitoba. Just a note, for those of you who are following discussions across Canada, Newfoundland, which is right next to Ontario there, is about to rocket off to the right side of this chart. Because of significant cost overruns at the Muskrat Falls project, their rates are set to double. So they'll be way over on the right side of this chart shortly. And some of the other jurisdictions also have rate pressures because of cost overruns in some of their generation projects. So that's North American perspective on electricity rates. What about from a global perspective? If Ontario is a country, how do we look compared to the rates that people pay in other parts of the world? And here you can see, again, we look pretty good. We have relatively low rates compared to most places in the world. But there are a few countries with lower rates. You may wonder about that. And I think that needs a little perspective as well. Most of those countries that have lower rates, their citizens have significantly lower incomes than Ontario residents have in Ontario households. So what if we adjust for that? How do rates look as a percentage of household income if we take that same ordering of countries? And here you can see Ontario is basically tied for second lowest in the world in terms of electricity rates as a percentage of household income. We actually look very good, and that's because the incomes are really quite low in some of those countries that have low rates. So from an international perspective, we actually look really good in terms of our rates. There's one more overlay that we need to put on top of that, and that's the countries to the left of Ontario have very dirty grids, I would say. They're burning coal and other and petroleum and high carbon intensity to generate those electricity rates that are lower than ours. So if we adjust for that, if we take the same chart and look at the carbon intensity of the electricity grid in those systems, we can see those countries to the left of us, those ones that show as having lower rates, all have high levels of carbon output coming from their system. So from that perspective, when you step back and look at that from a North American or international perspective, electricity rates in Ontario, they actually look pretty good. Not a crying need for additional rate reductions or subsidies. I do want to speak to this whole issue of, yes, but Quebec and Manitoba have lower rates and they're our neighbors. I think it's a common ploy amongst those who are looking to inflame the debate in Ontario, to deliberately inflame it, to point to Quebec and Manitoba and say, oh, that shows a gross mismanagement of our system. Our rates should be something like they are in Quebec and Manitoba. And I think that's deliberately trying to mislead Ontarians, and I think it's inappropriate. And here's why. This is a look at the resource mix and the makeup of the electricity supply in the 6 biggest provinces in Canada. And what you can see here is that Quebec and Manitoba have the great fortune of having access to legacy hydro assets, which were built decades ago, and provide really affordable electricity for their citizens. Ontario, long ago, lost the topography capability to add legacy hydro assets, which would provide affordable power to us today. We started transitioning in the 50s and 60s to other resources, and you can see that other provinces had to do the same. So Ontario is never going to be Quebec and Manitoba. We don't have access to the topography that would allow for cheap hydro assets. And new hydro assets are expensive anyways. So it's not appropriate to compare us to Quebec and Manitoba. If you compare our rates to the other two provinces on this chart, we actually look very good. We have lower rates. If you did want to make a fair comparison of Ontario to some of its neighbors, you might look at these neighbors, New York, Ohio, and Michigan. They have access to a smaller component of legacy hydro assets like Ontario does, but are reliant on other resources. And Ontario actually, compared to these neighbors, looks pretty good. So when you compare Ontario on a fair basis to jurisdictions that don't have access to low-cost legacy hydro assets that were built decades ago, we actually look pretty good. I'm going to skip over this slide. We talk in the paper about, some people suggest we do a deal with Quebec. We speak to that in the paper. If you want to go read that, you can hear our thoughts about that. Some people think there's this magical solution that we can just approach them. And we speak to the possibility there. So going back to that voter reaction, I had mentioned that voter reaction was wildly disproportionate to what actually happened to them. So we put together some data in our study that tried to put that into perspective. What actually did happen to the typical household with those electricity rate increases that we know happened? Well, here's what the Statistics Canada data shows us, that electricity went up, after inflation, went up by about $8 a month for the typical household. But at the same time, natural gas rates have really dropped. So the natural gas, the component of the household energy bill, actually dropped by $30 a month. So really, households are better off with the household energy bill. Again, this doesn't point to a crying need for subsidies. I'm going to skip over this commentary on water rates. So here's another perspective, putting electricity rates as a percentage of household expenditures, and you can see that they're quite tiny, the electricity bill as a percentage of household income. And this gives you a historical perspective of what's been happening in Ontario. And really what we see is we look back in 1981, it was 1.1%, and now it's 1.2%. We're pretty much near historical lows as a percentage of household income. And natural gas, as we mentioned, has come down significantly. So altogether, the household energy bill is at a historic low over the past 4 decades. Again, not pointing to a crying need for subsidies as a solution. We're actually doing very good from this perspective. We do go take a peek at what did happen to household expenses over the past 7 or 8 years. And these two charts put those into perspective. What were the expenditure increases that did impact the households, and where were their decreases? And of course, housing stands out as being the really big impact that households have experienced in the past 7 years. And that is mortgage payments and rent, if you want to know what that OEA teal colored pie chart is. And tuition actually was an interesting one that showed up as a pretty significant household impact, even though many households don't have someone going to university, showing that there was something significant happening there. Now I threw in case you can see it, it's very small, but I would point you to the really small red wedge, which shows what the impact was after inflation of the electricity rate increases on the household expenditures. And you can see it was insignificant. So again, showing that there was really a wildly disproportionate reaction of people to rate increases compared to what they were actually experiencing. So this next chart is meant to just to give you a quick view of the subsidies that we do have in place now. Governments responded way back when, as we know, by introducing subsidies to that voter outpouring of anger. We're now spending $3.6 billion on what we call electricity cost refinancing, really, which was basically the Fair Hydro plan of the previous government. And we also introduced a PST, the provincial sales tax rebate, which is running at about $1.2 billion. And the report talks about them in more detail, so you can go there if you want to read about some of those other subsidies. We're just going to try and put some of these subsidies into perspective. So about that $3.6 billion in electricity cost refinancing, we need to give you this background so we can talk about the 12% reduction. This is a reminder of what the Fair Hydro plan was, the electricity cost refinancing. That was a plan to borrow $19 billion to lower rates by 17%. And if you added that to the 8% sales tax rebate, you got 25%. So borrow $19 billion, and ratepayers were going to have to pay that back to the tune of $40 billion by the time you accounted for interest. That, in return, was going to require annual bill increases of 7% a year from 2021 to 2029. That is what the government walked into. Now, a credit and a shout out to David Haynes of QP Briefing, who asked me the question when the Premier started to get peppered about questions about this 12% reduction commitment in late 2019 and early 2020. The question started to come back. David asked me the question when he was reporting on the issue. He said, Vince, what should the government be measured against? And our answer is very straightforward. It's simply what they inherited. This is the cost curve that the government walked into. This is what they inherited. This would be the measuring stick you would use to measure whether or not they met a commitment to meet a 12% reduction. Now, about these types of subsidies, I'll just mention quickly, we've polled Ontarians about doing this, about pushing costs into the future through borrowing, and they react negatively to it. You can see the response of them when they learn about the Fair Hydro plan. They're generally unaware of it. They don't like it and think we should get rid of it. And they've been consistent in that over time. Greg Lyle found this through an innovative research poll for the OEA, that even voters who are struggling to pay their electricity bill would tell innovative research we should stop pushing costs into the future, even if that means paying more. So voters don't like these schemes where we borrow in order to lower costs. Now, I just want to put into perspective these subsidies, these non-targeted subsidies that we've put into place. They represent about 85% of that $5.6 billion that we're spending non-targeted subsidies. Put those into perspective. They disproportionately go to people who don't need any assistance because they're not targeted. If we look at a typical apartment household and their usage, they'd get an annual subsidy of about $200 a year. And they would have a median household income of about $40,000 versus a single detached home. The median household income there, according to the census, is about $95,000. So dramatically higher. They get a much higher subsidy. But it gets even worse. The way our subsidies are designed, people who live in mansions get an extraordinarily high subsidy because they're also covered under this program. So someone living in a mansion might get $1,800 annually in a subsidy. So you can see there's a problem with large subsidy programs that aren't targeted. We have a lot of subsidies going to people who don't need them. Here's an example of a subsidy which gets the OEA Gold Star for the type of subsidy we should have. We have a program called the Ontario Electricity Support Program, and it's targeted to low-income households. And this shows what would happen for a three-person household that has a $35,000 annual income, which is a low income, who'd use what they would in an apartment, about 350 kilowatt hours a month in consumption. Their bill might be $52. The subsidy they get under the OESP would be $45, so their net bill would only be $7. And if you look back to that earlier pie chart I show you, this program goes out to all low-income households who need it if they apply for it, and it represents only about 200 million of that 5.6 billion. So a very high level and generous level of support to those who really need it, and it doesn't cost us a lot of money. It makes a lot more sense. It's the type of subsidy we should have. Now, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the politics of electricity subsidies and rate freezes and rate increases, because I think it's important to help us put into perspective these things. So I'm going to walk through as quickly as I can some of our historic experiences with these things and what the political outcome was. So just try to analyze it from more of a factual basis, not really a political basis. In 1993, when Darlington Nuclear Power Plant came on and the province was facing a recession at the same time, so demand dropped significantly, there was a run-up in rates as a result of that, 31% in 2 years between 91 and 93. Then Premier of the day didn't like the politics of these rate increases and some voter agitation, was worried about re-election prospects, and he instituted a freeze at 4.3 cents a kilowatt hour. Now that froze rates at below their economic recovery level for Ontario Hydro at the time. That ended up turning into a future debt that future ratepayers had to pay back, called the debt retirement charge. But nonetheless, he instituted a rate freeze at below cost, which required an effective subsidy. We all know the outcome, that it did not help them get reelected. If we fast forward to 2002, that rate freeze that Bob Rae had put in place was still in effect. It was lifted when the government of the day, under Mike Harris, wanted to open the market up for competition. Newly minted Premier Earnings came into place, and no surprise, when you lift a rate freeze that's uneconomic, that's been in place for 10 years, rates suddenly went up. And the Premier, facing a spring, a spring election, didn't much like the looks of that and reinstituted the 4.3% rate freeze. And of course, we know the outcome. That did not help them get reelected. So we fast forward to 2003. The McGuinty Liberals get reelected, and one of their campaign commitments actually is to maintain the 4.3 cent rate freeze. However, they also had a promise to balance the budget, and they figured out very quickly, by November of the following year, it had cost $700 million, and it was a taxpayer subsidy, the freeze that Ernie Eves brought in. Government had spent $700 million, and I just want to quote you from McGuinty's announcement at the time. We are going to move to a price regime that better reflects the true cost of electricity. And they announced 28% increase in rates. And Dwight Duncan was the energy minister at the time, and he called what we were doing unsustainable. Of course, we know the outcome. Even though they announced a rate increase and it represented a breaking of an election commitment, they were nonetheless reelected. Fast forward to 2010, Brad Duguid is now the energy minister, and they released what's called a long-term energy plan, the 2010 long-term energy plan. And I just want to read you directly a quote from that long-term energy plan. Residential electricity prices are expected to rise by about 7.9% annually, or over 46% over 5 years. So here's the government publicly disclosing that significant rate increases were coming. And it took significant heat in terms of articles and media, but nonetheless, they were reelected. I want to fast forward to the 2013 long-term energy plan. That plan, and here we have a new premier, of course, and Bob Chiarelli is the energy minister. When they released that plan, they announced again that electricity rates would rise by 42% over 5 years, and again took a lot of heat, a lot of attention. But nonetheless, we know the outcome. They were reelected. I'm going to go to our last example, and we know what happened here. We pointed out the spike in voter agitation, and the government of the day responded in a huge way with massive subsidies. They are worried about their reelection prospects. We were a year away from an election, basically at this point, and they announced a 25% reduction in rates and a huge subsidy. And of course, we know what happened, that notwithstanding the fact that they introduced a huge subsidy, they were not reelected. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, you can't learn too much because elections are complicated things, but if one of your hypotheses was that introducing big subsidies will help you get reelected, there's not a lot of evidence to show that that's true. If you had another hypothesis that said, well, if you announced significant rate increases, you can't get reelected, there's also not a lot of evidence to suggest that that's true. So I think we tend to overestimate the political impact because elections are actually very complicated things and voters vote for a variety of other reasons, not just on electricity rates. So now we want to talk to get to that 12% reduction discussion. And this is just before we start that, to say our view is that most of the costs in the system are fixed. We have a fixed cost electricity system by and large in the short and medium term. Therefore, if you want to lower electricity rates at any meaningful level, it's going to require a subsidy. And that's the point we make in the paper, and you can read about it. So we asked the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy and Kevin Page and his team to analyze 3 options for the government to meet its commitment to lower rates by 12%. And they're kind of bookended options. I'll explain that. This is the first option. The government could say, well, we just took what we inherited from the previous government. And it's back to that question, what are we measuring them against? Well, this is what they inherited, that green curve. That was the Fair Hydro Plan. And if they just lowered rates by 12%, that would cost about $1.5 billion initially and ultimately $2.5 billion a year. The Institute calculated that would take about $97 billion in subsidies out to 2045. And at the same time, we'd still have to increase bills by 7% a year, because of course, under the Fair Hydro Plan, ratepayers are picking up most of the costs of the short-term subsidy. So to give you, and again, I'm going through these quickly, I know they're in the paper and described in more detail. A second option, a different bookend, and this one doesn't involve going back to ratepayers in the future like the Fair Hydro Plan. This involves just taxpayers picking up an immediate 12% reduction in the bills. So that $19 billion that future ratepayers are going to have to pay for it with interest disappears. The green curve disappears. The black curve represents the underlying cost of the system. The Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy calculated that that would cost us $213 billion out to 2045 when you count the interest costs. And of course, it's just a lot more expensive for taxpayers because they're picking up the whole tab to do this. Also keep in mind that these taxpayers are by and large the very same people as the ratepayers. So it's, in many ways robbing Peter to pay Paul. We asked the Institute to look at a third option, and this is the one that we ultimately recommended, which is to phase out the subsidies. And what this chart is showing what the Fair Hydro Plan was, showing what the cost curve was, the black curve. The government, introduced some cost reduction measures. They've already announced some of them, like for example, canceling energy contracts. Bruce Power has announced some power savings, and they reduced conservation expenditures. Those have the effect of lowering the cost curve. And if they phased out of subsidies, if they followed this plan, that would ultimately have a total cost of $50 billion with interest. To do it, it would require us to increase rates by about 3.5% a year until 2029. So you may be asking, Vince, well, how is it that can meet a 12% reduction commitment? And it does, because you're measuring it against what they inherited, that green curve. You're going to be introducing a new lower curve for the ratepayers that is significantly lower than what they were going to pay before. And it's happening because taxpayers are absorbing a big chunk of the early costs of the Fair Hydro Plan. So when you compare what ratepayers will act if they followed our recommendation to phase out of these subsidies, on average, the ratepayer would face rates that are 13% lower from 2022 to 2045 than they would have experienced versus what the government inherited. So at this point, I'm going to try, if I can get my computer, polling you to see what you think of these 3 options. You see them on your screen. There are 3 different options that we've put in front of you. I'd be curious, just give me a sec while I said it. I'm going to be curious what the people on the seminar think. Hopefully you can all see this poll live. I'd love to see what option you think the government you would have recommended that they take prior to the pandemic. There's still some numbers rolling in, so I'll end it in just a sec here. I think we're getting enough to get a sense of where people are at. Okay, that's probably enough. So I'm going to share the results here. You can see 84% of you like option 3, 6% option 2, and 10% option 1. So that's interesting. All right, I'm going to, just to keep in that, because we have some time pressure, just going to keep us moving here. I'm going to skip this slide. So let's just step back and summarize what we found in our report. We found that electricity rates are amongst the lowest in the world in Ontario. That Ontario is one of the greenest electricity systems, that as a percentage of household income, Ontario rates are second lowest in the world and at record lows in Ontario over the past 4 decades. We also found that the typical household's energy costs have fallen since 2008 due to declines in natural gas prices. And also that electricity costs just don't register as a significant household expenditure impact since 2010. Yet in spite of that, we're spending billions of dollars to subsidize electricity rates, and most of those subsidies are going to households who don't need them. So that leads to the recommendations that you'll see in our report. Our recommendation to the government was that if you want to meet your 12% rate reduction commitment, you do it by essentially writing off electricity cost financing subsidies, phase out of these refinancing subsidies. You eliminate the inflation cap, which is on electricity bills currently. You maintain the important targeted programs like the Low-Income Electricity Support Program, the OESP, the Remote Rate Protection Program. You leave the PST rebate in place because we thought it was just too big a hill to climb to take all of the subsidies off at once. And then you make energy cost minimization an ongoing priority. A little bit of a time to talk about our update since the addendum. Obviously, the pandemic and the lockdown has had a huge impact on our economy. I think this is a time we ought to take a step back and reevaluate our priorities as a society. And we wrote our addendum with that context in mind. So here's a different look at our subsidy picture right now. It peels away the whole 12% discussion. Here's the thing, if we don't take any action whatsoever, if we just leave the current inflation cap that's in place and the current PST rebate in place, we're going to spend about $228 billion with interest by the time we reach 2045. That's an extraordinary amount of money to spend on subsidies that are going primarily to people who don't need assistance. And I just wonder in this environment when we are going to be starved for resources and going to need to marshal all the resources that we have to help those who have been negatively impacted, both households and businesses, whether that really makes a lot of sense for us as a society. So just about that chart that I just showed you, this chart here, estimating 228 billion, it's probably an underestimate because we've had a big drop in demand, and that's actually going to increase the subsidy pressure in the system. So just keep that in mind. We've likely underestimated the amount of subsidies that are going to be required if we keep with our current policies. I also want to speak briefly to time of use rates. We found that time of use rates just suddenly rocketed up the public agenda when people were working from home. The Premier was getting peppered in all kinds of places by people expressing their concern that, oh, I'm going to be working from home and facing these peak rates, and I'm not going to be able to afford it. So the government responded quickly with a 21% rate reduction effectively by reducing time of use rates to the off-peak rate. Now we released a press release that commending the Premier for providing that calm and reassurance, because there was a public panic that was ensuing about time of use rates. But I do, and it was expensive what the Premier did. It cost $162 million for just 45 days. Again, not targeted, but he did provide that. He did calm the situation. I just want to take a minute to put time of use and working from home in perspective, which drove a lot of the politics about this. Putting aside, I know some people have had extraordinary, much larger impacts and more to worry about than just, their electricity bill impact. Working from home, from what I could read online, might mean a 2 to 7% increase in home energy consumption. So if we assume the highest to 7% of that, and all of it was at peak, which is unlikely, that might be at most a $10 a month impact, which is really not much. Just to put it in perspective, if you're working from home and you now have to cook lunch every day and use the stove for 15 minutes, that might cost you $1.56 a month. If you have the LCD TV on for 10 hours a day, when it used to be 2 because the kids are using it, that maybe is $4.50 a month. So you can start to see like working from home and time of use, these are not big household impacts. I want to contrast that impact, $10 a month maybe at most for some people, with a large expenditure reduction that most people are working from home are experiencing. There's been a huge reduction in their transportation costs. They're not out shopping anymore. They don't have daycare costs. They don't have takeout for lunches. They're not taking in recreational events. The typical household working from home based on, this is just rough estimates on my part. This is not a scientific study. A typical household might be saving $1,000 a month. Contrast that with a $10 a month, time of use impact. So what does that mean? And to put time of use into perspective, just to quote Barb Simpson, I'd say, don't have a cow, man. Like, this is not a big public policy issue. Regardless of what the government chooses to do going forward, if they lift it immediately, if they go back to time of use rates, if they go to single electricity rate, in the grand scheme of things, impacts that people are experiencing, it is pretty much a non-issue. So let's ask another polling question. Since I've provided this background, I'm going to see if I can get the poll to come up again, if I can get my computer to cooperate. Here we go. I'm going to go to poll. Just bear with me a sec. So here's the poll question. I'm curious on people's poll. You should see it live now. Which option do you think the government should pursue? Should it maintain the off-peak rate costing $110 million a month? Should it cancel it and transition it to something else? Or should it just cancel it outright? Be curious to see what you have to say. I see the votes rolling in, so we'll share those results shortly. Okay, I'm gonna cut off the poll now and share the results, and hopefully you can see those now. 10% of you like option A of maintaining the current subsidy. 56% of you think we should use those funds and transition to some other form of customer relief. And 34% of you think we should just cancel it outright, and then we have the subsidies we need in place. So thanks everybody for sharing your view on it. Now let's keep things going here. Excuse me a sec. So just want to give an update to our study on our conclusion. We are in a post-pandemic world. There have been some very significant impacts on a lot of households. We're aware of that, but it hasn't changed our recommendations from a previous study. We still think we should be phasing out subsidies to those who don't need them as soon as possible. We think we should end this 21% rate reduction as soon as possible. It's not targeted. It's actually a windfall for households who are working from home. We think we know the pandemic and lockdown has created hardship for many households, and that we're going to need all the resources that we can marshal to help struggling families and businesses. We think those struggling families and businesses should be the recipients of some targeted relief programs, not general relief programs. And back to the point of our original paper, which we think remains valid today, we think we should help those who need help. So we've been managed to get through the presentation in the time we allotted. So I want to circle back to Ian. I think Ian, you were going to review the questions that were coming in and just let me know what people were asking, if anything.
Thank you very much, Vince. That was a great presentation, great pace, and lots of information. We do have some questions. I see they're There's some more coming in, so please, folks, keep those coming. I have been reading the ones coming in, and just kind of as a contextual question, Vince, I wanted to ask, and you've pointed this out a couple times, the view that voter reaction has been wildly disproportionate to actual on-the-ground circumstances and pain or lack thereof. And I guess a lot of the questions get at what we should do about that, or is that really the case? What are we missing? So in your experience, do you have any theories about why voter reaction is so disproportionate if the actual impact is as de minimis as the study seems to suggest?
You know, it is the right questioning, and it's a very good question. Maybe there's a role for public education. I think people react out of fear. They think there's going to be huge impacts when they read about isolated, anecdotal, unique bill impacts in the press. They think it reflects their own circumstance when it doesn't. You know, as I said, I thought electricity rates just became a convenient totem for voters, a place for them to place their anger with the previous government. And it went away rather quickly, and they're calmer again about electricity rates. So the other thing is, I think, is we did introduce programs when people were concerned about bills that were excellent programs that were very well targeted to the challenge that voters were facing. So for example, the Ontario Electricity Support Program, the government way back then almost doubled the benefits, and they enhanced the relief for people who had electric heat. And that was where a big part of the problem was people who had electric heat were experiencing a disproportionate impact to rate increases. So there you have a program which was helping those who are actually experiencing a problem, but we never gave it a chance to work. We didn't have a political response that said, look, I know you're all concerned about electricity rates. We're going to look after everyone who's experiencing a problem. And if we'd done that, it would have been very affordable for us. So if you look at that Ontario Electricity Support Program, we almost doubled the amount of relief provided. We enhanced the relief for people who have electric heat. What an excellent design to a program. And that really is the kind of thing we need to do. The same with the rural and remote relief. You know, it's more expensive to get electricity out to those rural areas. And most of those people rely on electric heat to heat their homes. Again, we enhanced those subsidies, but we didn't give them a chance to work and look at the public and say, you know, we've taken care of those who need it. We came in with these mass subsidies to everybody, and they didn't really need them. So I didn't think we gave ourselves a fighting chance to do what the situation actually required.
A number of people are asking Vince, interesting results, particularly on the residential side, but what about the commercial and industrial rates, which of course are differently translated from the real-time market through to retail rates, and some are suggesting have a much larger impact on corporate viability, business viability, jobs, and that has obviously a trickle-down effect to the average person as well. So was any work done on C&I, and if not, what do you think about that?
Good question. We did not focus on C&I. As I mentioned at the start, it was too much for us to try and tackle all the electricity system issues. They are really complicated and difficult issues related to commercial and industrial rates. There is an issue there. It's not the same chart when we do the North American and the international comparisons on our electricity rates. We're not as competitive on that front. We are doing some work on offering rates to help companies that want to expand and provide incentives for companies to locate here, because you know, this drop in demand, we need to do something about that. We need to get our demand back up, because it actually increases pressure on rates. But there's no question also, Ian, we're going to need to do something to help struggling businesses. And I don't doubt that the government is grappling with that. This pandemic is going to have a devastating impact on a lot of businesses. Small businesses are covered in what we're talking about here, by the way, these RPP rates. Small businesses are eligible for these rates, so all of what we've talked about here applies to them. But for those with a general service above 50, you know, as we talk about it in the sector, for the medium and larger businesses, we need to think about something to help them out in this current situation, and also to help them be more competitive with respect to electricity rates. One thing I'd say about it, Ian, is if we're spending $5.6 billion providing subsidies to people who don't need it, it doesn't give us any fiscal room to help out those businesses in any way. And that's part of the problem that we have.
Vince, there's a question that thank you for that answer, and that deals with a lot of what people are asking. There's a question which suggests that the analysis didn't take account of the GEA or global adjustment component of bills. It seemed to me like you were dealing with total numbers. Can you just clarify that?
Yeah, the global adjustment is blind to the RPP. Ratepayers just pay the combined total rate, so it's irrelevant for a discussion about the RPP. Again, this study was about the RPP because that's where the votes are that drive the issue. The RPP is just the combination of the hourly price and the global adjustment. It's a total electricity rate, and it's being subsidized. The residential voter doesn't see any of that. They're not aware of that, and so the GA is irrelevant to this discussion of voters who have been driving the politics. They're not aware of the GA. That's more of a business customer discussion. And I know people are interested in that, and you've mentioned it and asked about it, but it's not something that we got into in this discussion.
And a couple of questions along these lines, and I think you've answered this in a way, but maybe worth reiterating. Poking electricity rates seems to ignite voter concern, or at least elected official perception of voter concern, as opposed to simply leaving things be. So a question about the dynamics a bit more complicated than the numbers you presented would indicate, and while they're sensible, any attempt to deal with electricity rates in a way that's different from what the platform the government was elected on, is going to just inflame the situation out of control. So what do you think we as a sector can do, and how can we help our elected officials to deal with this in a rational way, accepting for the purposes of this discussion that what you presented is the rational way to deal with this, and we should be more cognizant of the actual costs of these policies rather than kind of voter backlash. How do we manage that?
Thanks, Ian. It's a really good question. And our recommendation for how you manage it is that you keep bills stable. So we are cognizant of that in making our recommendation. We've been in the field with focus groups in the past, and the typical voter and ratepayer, they evaluate their bill on a month-by-month basis. And if there's not dramatic shifts in their bill, that's why you see the word stability and stabilize in the title of our paper. If we can provide a system that gives them that stability and certainty about where bills are going, our recommendation suggested 3.5% a year increase. It's very manageable. It's not the kind of thing that I think would drive a lot of ratepayer and voter reaction by coming up with a manageable solution to get out of these untargeted subsidies. So that's one thing that I would say about it. The second thing I would say about the politics is that we're in a pandemic environment, and this is a different world. It might actually be a time when you could look voters in the eye, and if you had the will, I guess it's easy for me to say, and I know that it's tough, but if there ever was a time you could look at voters and say, look, we're spending $5.6 billion for subsidies to a lot of people who really don't need them. We need that money to help people who have been negatively affected by this pandemic. We need the resources to help people recover. If there's ever a time you could say that, now would be the time. But failing that, and I know that's easy for me to say, just have a graduated way of getting out of these subsidies and a game plan, and you won't face the negative voter reaction. You recall 2016 and 17, I just as a reminder, rates went up 17% in total in that year, and that's what triggered, a reaction. And we need to avoid sudden spikes like that. And if we avoid those, I think we can avoid those type of voter reaction.
We've got a whole bunch of questions coming in, so that's great, folks. Thank you. Keep them coming. We have another 6 minutes. We're going to have a hard stop, so I'll try to give Vince 30 seconds at the end to, again, wrap up and thank you. But in the meantime, let me see if I can get to some more of these. There are a couple of comments and questions, Vince, which again are taking us back to C&I rates and the really different sorts of impacts that electricity costs in Ontario have on our businesses. And it seems to me that you've essentially addressed this topic in a way, in an important way, by noting that reducing subsidies for those that don't need it provides funding for sectors that really do require relief, whether in respect of energy costs or other areas. But given this discussion is about energy costs, what's the view on rechanneling some of these subsidies in the coming months and perhaps years to manufacturing and industrial operations to keep them in Ontario, or perhaps even someday attract them back?
You know, I like the question. I know this is a very serious issue facing the province, and I know this report's about the RPP rates. I know we have a serious challenge on our hand with businesses and with commercial and industrial rates. What I'd say to our commercial and industrial customers is that they need to speak up about these subsidies that are going to people who don't need them. These huge subsidies, this $5.6 billion in subsidies that we're spending, as I see it, is the largest barrier they face to getting some form of assistance from the government. As long as we're spending so much to subsidize rates, the government is just not going to have the resources to be able to offer some assistance and the kind of incentives that they have in other jurisdictions. So their clearest and most direct path to getting some assistance is to get us as quickly as possible to stop this practice of subsidizing residential electricity rates when we really don't need to.
Now, Vince, a couple of people are asking questions along the lines of what feedback, if any, so far you've had from government and other policymakers on these results and the view put forward. And perhaps you can also address your thoughts on next steps. How should we approach rejigging this picture? A comment about the possibility of looking at income strata or trying to identify some of the more vulnerable groups that you've alluded to in your comments and how to target relief programs to them. So reaction from policymakers and suggestions, thoughts on next steps.
Yeah, well, like the rest of you today, the government is only just seeing our report, so we're looking forward to their reaction and having a dialogue about the discussion. Listen, I recognize to the government and to the opposition parties, it's that they're concerned about the politics of electricity. We're trying to do our part here to provide public education, and maybe there's a role for all of us working together to increase that level of public education, to avoid panics, unnecessary panics about electricity rates, to try and provide that common reinsurance. And maybe there's a role for the reporters too, who are writing about these rates. I know we like to whip ourselves up into a frenzy easily, but it seems there's a pretty viable path for us out of this. I think it's inevitable in our future. Some politician, like has happened a couple of times we've seen in the past, is going to come forward and say, this is just not sustainable. We can't sustain this level of subsidies. We need this funding for other purposes. It's easy for me to say, and I recognize that, we want to work with government and the opposition parties to try and get everybody on the same page. That's hard to achieve in a competitive political environment. But maybe if we all work together, we can find that path and do some good coming out of that and get access to these funds to get them to those targeted households you referenced in your question. We don't have any difficulty designing programs that we've got a couple of very good ones that are designed to meet very specific needs, and we can leverage that infrastructure and provide additional resources if need be, and including some that are specific to COVID and the pandemic, some specific pandemic programs. But we're certainly limited in resources now with what we're spending.
Thanks, Vince. And we're just about out of time. I'll hand it back to you in about 30 seconds. Just note one other comment that's come through, which I think is a very good one and important to recognize as we collectively talk to policymakers and talk to each other about these findings and the path forward, that we have invested in Ontario quite a bit in cleaning up our system, which the conventional thinking, I think, is we'll pay back in the future. You know, as carbon emissions become more expensive, we're ahead of that curve. And so while we've incurred that cost, it will be worthwhile. And especially put within the context of the charts that you you presented will make our overall energy supply in the province even more cost effective than it already is, despite what we hear and kind of the visceral reactions we get sometimes. So thank you all. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. The feedback's been tremendous, Vince. I think there's a huge appetite for more of this discussion. So I'll leave that suggestion with you and hand it over to you for any closing remarks.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks again for helping us host this webinar. And thanks all of you for joining. I hope you enjoyed the background materials. We welcome feedback on what you see. We tried to do a factual summary of what we saw in Ontario. Please give us your feedback if you have any. If you want to engage us in questions, we're here. That's what we're here for, is the Ontario Energy Association. And we look forward to carrying on this dialogue with you. So thanks everybody very much for joining this morning. We appreciate it.
Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.